Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this huge and very important topic. This is a peer exchange, and we hope that there's quite a bit of interactivity with you, the registrants and the attendees and the educators who are in the room with us. I'm Carolyn Jacobs. I'm in the GBH Education department. We are recording this session, and you will receive the recording link along with links to all of the resources that we're showcasing tonight in an email that comes out tomorrow evening. So you don't need to take notes if you don't like. If you would rather not, you'll also receive a link to the slides, and there are lots of hot links in the slides also. Denise Olson, who's the director of marketing, is kind of behind the scenes, and she's watching the chat. Make sure that your chat is set to everyone so that you can, so that we can all see your comments, not just panelists. So as I mentioned, I'm in the education department, but GBH is Boston's public media station and the producer of many iconic series that you see on stations across the country. So programs such as American Experience, Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, lots of programs for kids, all originate in Boston. In the education department, we create services and produce educational resources for pre-K to 12 educators and students. GBH is a founder is a co-founder and manager along with PBS of the free platform PBS LearningMedia. This is where you will find the resources that we're showcasing tonight. There are thousands of resources on the site produced by partners and other public media stations around the country. GBH is a major producer of the resources. And the resource, when I say the word resource, that kind of translates in our world to often taking a full-length program, like a 60-minute American Experience program or a 30-minute Molly of Denali program, and creating resources from that longer piece, short clips, contextualized with support materials to help you really flush out a whole lesson. Free site, and I hope that many of you are already familiar with it and are using it. If not, check it out. I want to thank and acknowledge our funders, Nellie Mae Education Foundation and Virginia Wellington Cabot Foundation, for supporting this work and this webinar. This is the third in a series of 4 that we have run on the general topic of culturally responsive teaching. And you'll have the webinar recording links of 2 others that we did earlier. And then we have another following Thursday in 2 nights, and that will be for similar to this, but for grades 6 to 12. So this one showcases a curriculum that was created for Somalian refugee population in Lewiston, Maine, in collaboration with Bates College. So check that out if you have an interest in that. And then also we ran a webinar in December, supporting literacy with cultural responsiveness, featuring Tracy Bailey Swinton, who is an author and the founder of Freedom Readers. And you'll have the links to both of those recordings. All right, our presenters tonight, we are very pleased to have with us Steven Chen. He is our featured presenter. Steven is a nationally certified facilitator and also the assistant head of school at Boston Latin School. Previously to this, he worked for Boston Public Schools as the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer and the Director of Training and Accommodations. And what that translates to in those roles, he partnered with schools and central office leaders to consult and coach on bias-based curriculum and to create a welcoming and inclusive environment for students and educators. Prior to joining Boston Public, Steven was a curriculum chair, curriculum specialist, and high school English teacher in Arkansas. He holds a BA from the University of South Carolina and California, excuse me, and a JD from Boston Law School. Welcome, Steven. Thank you. We also have with us Denise Cooper. Denise is a new educator ambassador working with GBH for the next couple of years. We're just getting to know her, and she jumped right in to say that she wanted to present on this webinar. We really appreciate it. She's finishing her master's degree in technology right now, and she teaches a very diverse group of approximately 60 third graders in one of two public 100% virtual schools in Massachusetts. So COVID and going virtual was nothing new for Denise. This is something that she does all the time. And she is a huge fan of public media resources and a great champion for them. Beth I'm going to get it right, Frankowiak has an MS in art education, and she is a colleague of mine. She works in the public media world, Director of Education and Outreach at Buffalo Toronto Public Media. And as the Director of Education, Beth is deeply involved in producing resources that are published on PBS LearningMedia, and you're going to see an example of that. I also want to acknowledge Sarah Vincent, who is a fourth grade teacher in Springfield Public Schools. She was also going to present with us. She is a past educator ambassador, but she had a family issue that she had to deal with. So we miss her and wish her the best. All right, the agenda tonight, Steven is going to kick it off and kind of lay the groundwork for anti-bias and culturally responsive teaching. He will respond to a couple of questions, and I want to acknowledge that I would say about 70 to 80% of you did submit questions ahead of time. And thank you for doing that. The presenters have seen the questions. They're trying to work some of that into their presentation. Of course, we're not going to be able to do it all. Steven is going to be available after his presentation for a couple of questions, and then he needs to excuse himself. And we'll keep going with questions and conversation among us and all of you. Knowing that this is a huge topic, we're just going to tackle some of the supplemental resources that you can use and kind of lay the groundwork for what we're doing in defining terms. Denise is going to showcase a particular collection on PBS LearningMedia. And then Beth will show us the interactive lesson that her station produced that's on PBS LearningMedia. And interspersed, I'm going to have lots of other suggestions of resources for you. Again, all links will be available to you on this resource document. And Denise will be available to post some things in the chat if you kind of get lost. Okay. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Steven. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Really, really appreciate being here with all of you. And I know that we can't be in person and this is virtual, but hopefully what this session will do, especially in this opening part, is to set the groundwork and set some common foundational definitions, some ways that we can kind of share the same common language around cultural anti-bias and culturally responsive teaching. So if you can move to the next slide, Carolyn. Normally, this would be a turn and talk with someone sitting around with you. But just to get us started, I'd love for people to use the chat feature just to start with some initial thinking around what are we talking about when we're talking about bias? How would you define it? Is it always good? Is it always bad? Is it somewhere in between? What do we mean when we're talking bias and anti-bias education? I'd love to get some thoughts on the chat, and I'll be monitoring that as you put some stuff down. So Annie says preconceived ideas, beliefs based on experience, past experiences, treating someone differently, good or bad. And Jessica puts the note, everything is biased. Unconscious thoughts, being judgmental. Awesome. So people can keep adding on to that. And I'm going to add an additional part to this question now. As you're sort of thinking about these definitions, why does this matter for our educators? Why does it matter for us to think about and actively be intentional about anti-bias and culturally responsive teaching? Like, why are we all here at this webinar? And I'd love to get some ideas from that too. And I'll just, as you are answering, you can also look at some what other people are writing in this chat. So Elisa says something really important. In multicultural education, we need to make students feel they will be treated equally, so we remove bias. Belinda says it matters because teachers need to understand biases and become educated so they can move past them and teach. It can cause racial trauma. It causes a narrow perspective of our world. And Christine, you also bring up a really important point. Everyone comes with different experiences. We'll talk a little bit about mirrors and windows. How do we create a safe and all-inclusive environment? So this is super helpful for me, and I hope all of you are sort of reading these thoughts. Carol, you can go to the next slide. What I did was I put together, and these are all like really, really important definitions, but just to kind of get everyone on the same page with some of the things that we want to talk about in tonight's workshop, is I looked up a couple of foundational definitions just to kind of get us a working understanding of how we're talking about this. Everything that people have said, I think all fits into this. But as we're thinking about both anti-bias education and culturally responsive pedagogy, I think one of the key things is you can't really have one without the other. And these two things really have to go hand in hand. So if we look at these definitions, what we see is that anti-bias education is an approach to teaching and learning designed to increase understanding of differences in their values and to actively challenge bias, stereotyping, and all forms of discrimination in schools and communities. So when we look at that and we compare it to culturally responsive pedagogy, what we see there is it engages identities and identity issues across all groups and communities: gender, ability or disability, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, and nationality. So when we look at these two definitions, a lot of times people do use them interchangeably as synonyms of very similar ideas. But really what we're looking at is, one is an active approach to teaching designed to increase understanding and differences. So one is very teacher focused. And then the other, with the cultural responsive pedagogy, is very student focused, which is how do we engage students as they come to us, as they are in our classroom, right? How do we make sure that we support all of those identities? You can go to the next slide, Carolyn. So to get us started, there is a framework that exists for identifying bias in curriculum. We don't have the ability to go through all 7 forms. In fact, we could probably do a 2-day workshop on just these 7 forms of bias. Excuse me. But what we wanted to do was I wanted to just kind of introduce, so you can find this actually by putting on Google, and we'll also send this afterwards, the 7 forms of bias in instructional materials, where ultimately there's 7 key ideas. The first is invisibility, which is when you complete the complete or relative exclusion of a group, right? The idea that there are some things that we don't actually even talk about in the classroom. The second is this idea of stereotyping, which is a rigid set of characteristics to all members of a group. The third is imbalance and selectivity, presenting one interpretation of an issue, situation, or group of people. The fourth is called unreality, which is when you have instructional materials to gloss over unpleasant facts and events. So you see this a lot in curriculum where it glosses over certain events in history, such as slavery or such as the Jim Crow era, or things about anything sort of unpleasant, right? The fifth is fragmentation and isolation, which is a special chapter insert appearing in a text. I think we've all seen it in our textbooks before, where you have a science textbook and then somewhere there is a special insert that says like women in science, and there's a 1-pager that specifically highlights that. And while that normally seems like it's like, oh, that's a good thing, what it actually does, it actually calls out that in a way that actually creates some bias. The 6th is linguistic bias, which is how we use language, how we talk about certain groups. And then the 5th is cosmetic bias, which is the illusion of equity. Now, I said I wouldn't be able to go through all of these all at once, but I think today's conversation will be really important in terms of thinking about invisibility. And so that's going to be the focus of this opening. Is just talk about, like, what does invisibility mean? Why are we, what are we looking at, and what are we talking about when we talk about invisibility? So we can go into the next slide. So the reason why we want to focus on invisibility is invisibility really is one of the most fundamental and oldest forms of bias in instructional materials. And it's really when you have a complete or relative exclusion of a group, right? So textbooks published prior to 1960 largely omitted African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, both from the narrative and illustrations. Many of today's textbooks, and you'll see this, and in fact, it's moving very rapidly right now. We see a lot more inclusion, we see a lot more representation, but we still see continuing people that are missing from our texts. You can go to the next slide, Carolyn. And this gets to this idea, and here's some stats that I just wanted to share with you all. So when we look at the diversity gap in children's books, right? And so I know that most of you here are in the K-5 world. What you see is that when we look at the number of books published in the United States from 1994 to 2017, the 37% of the people in the United States are people of color, but in 2017, only 13% of children's books in the past 24 years contain multicultural content. And it has gone up, but marginally compared to the population. And so one of the key things that I wanted to highlight here is this idea of mirrors and windows. And this actually goes to one of the comments that was brought up earlier in in the chat, which is it's really, really important for us to think about books and curriculum as both providing a mirror to a world where students can see themselves, right? Where students can see themselves reflected in the curriculum, just as it's important sometimes for students to also have windows into experiences that they otherwise would not know about. They can see other experiences. And so this is a quote from Rudine Sims Bishop, which says, "Books are sometimes windows offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange, when lighting conditions are just right. However, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us, and in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experience as part of the larger human experience." And this gets to our last, the next quote, which is, this comes from Adrian Rich, which is, "When someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into the mirror and saw nothing," right? And I'll share a quick personal example about this. So I grew up in the United States as an immigrant, moved here when I was 3 years old. And through my entire K-5 education, when I grew up in both New Mexico and Oregon, there was only one book written by an Asian author that I read anytime between kindergarten through 12th grade. I did not know that Asian people wrote books. I did not know that Asian people actually wrote literature at all. I really loved going to English classes, but it wasn't until I got to college and my freshman year, I saw some of the electives, and one of them was a class on Chinese literature. And I remember thinking, like, that's really funny. I wonder what they're going to read. What could they there couldn't possibly be any books. And it wasn't until I got to college that for the very first time, I realized that I was not going to be a trailblazer and become the first Asian writer that other people would read. But that's kind of what ends up happening if you don't include the representations, the identities, the culture of the students that are in front of you. Is the students don't really have a lot to experience, right, if they're not seeing in school. And so if you can go to the, click again, Carolyn, there's a couple questions I wanted to throw to the group and to the audience, just to kind of transition to your next part. So I'd love for each of you to think about your own experiences in school. And have you ever had an experience, and if to the extent that you're comfortable, I'd love for you to share, what was a time in school when you saw nothing, as you can see in this quote? And if you did have this experience, what was it? And if you didn't have this experience, why do you think that is? And I'll give everyone a second to type. So Debbie's saying that she did not experience this because she was I'm assuming, Debbie, that the books that you saw, the materials that you saw reflected your race, which you said you're white and you're part of this, the privileged or entitled class. And Christine, you say the same thing. And Julian, you talk about this question when you focused on world history, but world history in this case was a lot of Western Europe. Alex, you say in school you never saw another trans person in the curriculum. I'm assuming in the curriculum. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And Belinda, as a Black female, there were rarely occasions when African Americans were reflected. And you talk about emotionally, your feelings, what you were thinking were not reflected, but physically you were. And then Jessica, you talk about science, right? You did not see yourself in any of those science classes. And if you did, you might have seen it in some of those cutoffs of like women in science. That was one page in the textbook, if at all. Yeah, didn't hear a lot about women. Yeah, and Annie, thank you for sharing that story. That's a really hard story where, you know, Annie points out as a young child, she wished she had blonde hair. She would draw myself with blonde hair and cried because you wanted to go to heaven, right? And that was your representation where only angels were blonde white beings. And that was incredibly, incredibly difficult. And Linda, you talked about getting to university. That was my experience too. So I didn't get to read all of your comments, but I really, really appreciate you sharing all of this, because ultimately what your conversation today, when you talk about these GBH resources, is really thinking about how can we have greater representation? How can we really think about giving and creating experiences where not only is the teacher actively thinking about all the different ways that they are countering stereotypes or countering narratives that are dominant and not necessarily accurate, but in reverse, also thinking about culturally responsive education, where you can think about this through the lens of who are the students that are in front of me? What do I want them to know about themselves through mirrors? But then what do I want my students to know about others through windows, right? And both of those are really, really important. So as educators, you'll have a really big task in terms of how you work with your students. But I think, this workshop's a really great opportunity to sort of think through some of these questions and some resources about how to do that. So Carolyn, if you want to move to the next slide, I guess I have some time for some questions, but Carolyn, you can move to the next slide too.
Yeah, Steven, if there's something in the chat that you wanted to address, or maybe Denise noticed something, if not, I have a couple of questions that came in through the registration form.
Yeah. No, I just want to say, I really appreciate everyone sharing your stories about school. They're really powerful. And it's really, really important to point out both the stories of people who are telling us, I had no problem seeing myself and the reasons why. And then for those who didn't, how that impacted, each of these attendees as students.
You're muted, Denise. Sorry. You would think after 2 years. If you would speak for a minute about one person here, Jennifer asks about window books versus mirror books and the percentages of those. And does that depend on who's looking through and who's reflecting?
Yeah, so I don't think you're ever going to be able to get to a percentage, because I will say, if you have a book that's about a first generation immigrant from China or Taiwan or Asia, that's going to be a mirror book for me. But it's probably, for someone who doesn't have that background, it's going to be a window book for another student. So what you're not trying to do is, you're not trying to create a certain percentage of who are, I got to make sure that 60% of these books are reflective of students and 40% are not. That's not really the way that I would think about this. But what I would think about is, do you have a diversity of books, a diversity of curricular materials where students can see themselves in the world, in the material, excuse me, but then also can they see others and other experiences? Because it's also really important to build empathy. So I'm not sure if I would put any numerical quantification onto that, but I do think it's really, really important to note that if all of your books seem to have very similar types of characters or very similar types of narratives, it is important to re-examine that to figure out, does it make sense for us to change it up so that we do have additional representation, such as on the basis of disability, on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation, race, and national origin, and all these other ways that students come to us and bring their full selves into the classroom.
Steven, there were many questions submitted through the registration form about student voice. And one of them is acknowledges that there is so much power in student voice. And how can we empower students to be leaders in these conversations? Do you have any comments about that?
I do, and I'm going to speak on this from my lawyer standpoint first. So I am a lawyer, and I don't work as a practicing attorney, and this isn't legal advice, but I think it's really, really important to note, all your students have First Amendment rights, right? They have the rights to bring their full selves into the classroom. And what that means sometimes for student voice is, when we're talking about identities, it's really important to give students not the impetus or the force to share everything about themselves, but to say, you have to tell me everything about who you are. But it's important to bring student voice where you give students an opportunity, when they are comfortable and how they are comfortable, to share who they are, what they care about, and their why, right? And so as you're sort of thinking about this, I think one of the ways that student voice can get really disempowered, if you think about this, is when schools sort of discourage students from bringing their full authentic selves, or bringing their passions about, social justice or whatever it is. And instead of sort of telling students like, I don't know about this isn't, the right thing to approach, or the right way to go about this, it is really important to give students the ability to communicate and share who they are and what they care about. And that's through projects, that's through assignments, and also in much more informal ways, such as in after school clubs, activities. So you really can empower that voice.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to have to say goodbye to Steven now. I really appreciate you joining us for this time. Very helpful. And we'll continue to keep this conversations going. Thank you.
Right.
There were many questions in the registration form about resources, how you can learn more, what you should read. So these are just 3 examples that we know are acclaimed texts on the subject of culturally responsive teaching. In fact, we worked with Goldie Mohammed. She led a conversational webinar. And Goldie's book, I'm not as familiar with the other 2, but I am familiar with Goldie's work. And this came up in the registration questions about very specific lesson plan ideas across the curriculum that are culturally responsive and historically responsive in Goldie's case. And she does that. She does very specific lesson suggestions. So I thought if you wanted to share, I know that people are hungry for feedback about either you've already read one of these and you'd like to comment on it, or you have something else to recommend. Feel free to keep that in the chat. And we'll kind of aggregate the chat, curate it, I think curate's the word, and make sure that we get that list available to you. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Denise Cooper. You remember that she's the 3rd grade virtual teacher in a virtual school, and she's going to be showcasing a couple of resources.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's great to be here. So first, please forgive my voice. I'm having all kinds of voice issues and long haul. So I will do my best, and I promise to end in 10 minutes or my speech therapist will come for me. so, so first, I wanted to say, as I sort of set up and give the background, talking about this email that I received, and that family is here. So a huge thank you to them, much love for them. So culturally responsive teaching, and I see in the chat that a question was asked to show the difference, that culturally responsive teaching is not critical race theory. So there's a difference there. And I think that that's sort of where I came into this work. I was sort of on that side to say, oh, I don't do the culturally responsive thing. When we sort of talked about it, that's political, and I don't really get into the politics. And I'm sort of a hippie, and I'm much more about peace and love and joy. But I was like, but wait, but I do this. I do respond to my students. And this, as I was setting up for that aha moment, it came after, reading this email from my amazing student. And I was just in tears because he was like, wait a minute, I thought this was over. I thought we were all set with this. And realizing that that was my fault, that I was the one who had failed to show and had failed to teach my students about what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be a teacher of color, coming in wanting to provide a safe and happy space for them, but also sort of shielding that from them. So bringing that around and coming back to realize, like, this is my work and this is important and it matters, because culturally responsive teaching is about responding to the students, like Steven sort of mentioned, where they are, who are they, what makes them who they are. And when you're responding to your students, it's all child responsive. What is their culture? What makes all of them who they are? And you can go to the next slide, Carolyn. So culture is multifaceted. It can be a geographic location. Boston has its own culture. There's microcultures. I was born in Boston. So, the culture of East Boston, as opposed to South Boston, are very different. Or the North Shore is very different from the South Shore. What things that we have, the food is different. Sometimes the language is different. The people in that neighborhood are different. Culture can be this sort of family background or origin. What is your family dynamic? What is their makeup? And then, of course, culture can be chosen. And in the chat, if you want to put, what your classroom, or what is your culture, what culture do you foster in your classroom daily? And what are some of the norms that you adhere to? And I'll sort of respond to the chat as well. But this culture that can be chosen. I love country music, so that's a culture that I choose. It's not something I was born with or something that was given to me. It's something I choose. Your culture can be religious. If you're part of a religious community, there are things that make up your culture. It makes up who, and every church, every synagogue, every mosque can be different. It have a little bit of a different flavor, a little bit of a different culture, what is important. And then the biggest part I'll talk about here is that culture can be created. You can guide and change your classroom culture. What is your culture? What is important to your students? What is important to you? What do they hear when they come into your classroom? What are they experiencing in your classroom? Are they experiencing fairness? Are they experiencing joy? Are they experiencing being respected, being cared for? I'm careful to use the word love, because I think that's an extent that we push teachers to that might be too far. You can go to the next slide there, please, Carol. So during the pandemic, I had 30 students. Our school did not close during the pandemic, so we taught every day straight through. But I had to take some time in that time to take care of my family, take care of my mother. Shopping was crazy on the North Shore, just getting back and forth, getting the food that she needed. So PBS LearningMedia became a huge resource for me, because I could find resources quickly. They were virtual and I could easily implement them into my class. And my kids are online probably more so than other kids. And I sort of adapted to what are they already doing. That was a cultural response. I'm already seeing they're on PBS. They love PBS. I'm like, why fight it? I can use this to further their learning. One of the things that I love about this resource is it's called Hero Maker. And so Xavier Riddle is about history, and these students are sort of a younger version of the who was, where they're seeing themselves, and it's every kid can be a hero and every kid can do amazing things, but to see themselves as a hero. So we're talking about, Steve was talking about mirrors and windows, but to see themselves in history, but to see themselves as doing amazing, amazing things and amazing accomplishments. This resource came out of, for me to use this resource, came out of a discussion I had with my students about their self-portraits. And it was painful because some of my students of color were turning in self-portraits that didn't look like them. They had blonde hair, they were white, they looked nothing like my students. And interestingly, some of the other students that were white would put in a dark colored picture. And so it was interesting to see, what are they missing? Why aren't they seeing themselves as good enough to even put on a piece of paper to represent their own face? So that became a part that really sat with me deeply. So looking at that and looking at, why are they drawing themselves differently? Why don't they see themselves in represented in the curriculum, represented in history? So this Hero Maker game portrait is where they make themselves into the hero. They choose the colors, they choose the skin color, the hair color, and they start to see that they themselves, even as kids, can change the world. We did a bunch of projects about what can they do to change the world, and I wanted it to look like them. I recently was looking at the flower of privilege and thinking about how we all have privilege, and using that privilege and the giftings that my students have to change the world in their area, in their neighborhood, in their own community. um, Became a big deal. Also looking at, why do the pictures look different? Why why does your picture look different than my picture? You know, one of my students, and sometimes my class, I like to have a flipped classroom and a free form. And, you know, in the middle of class, the student raised a hand and I'm like, okay, sometimes I never know what's coming. I teach young students. I call them the littles. And the question was, why is that kid wearing a thing on their head? And my student was Muslim, and I'm like, that is completely unrelated to what we're talking about right at this moment. But okay, we'll go with that. and and then I was like, okay, do we want to pause and talk about that? So because kids are they're aware of the difference, but they're also, I think, far more okay with differences than we realize. So I said to the other student, do you want to explain what you're wearing and why? The girl explained, and the other student was like, okay. And then we moved on. So I think we make it much more complicated in some ways with the explanations um, for the students. And in terms of mirrors and windows, and my experience in terms of what Stephen was asking, I think the only one of the few books I saw as a child with a student of color, a kid in it, was Snowy Day. Was one of the very few. I didn't have any teachers of color growing up, from kindergarten through college, through my master's degree. Now I'm second master's degree, still have not had a teacher of color. So to give you an idea of how important this type of resource is for your students. And you can go to the next slide, Carolyn. I'm gonna grab some water. So I know I'm running out of time. I have 2 minutes. So the biggest thing is, these things must be taught explicitly. So I don't expect my students to catch math. I don't expect my students to catch reading. You know, it has to be taught explicitly. This has to be part of your work. I know one of the questions that someone had asked before the seminar was about the books and culturally relevant books. And that's my last point, is that the partners matter. My library in my town has done extensive work to make collections of diverse and windows, mirrors, inclusive collections they already have. So one of those important things is partnering with your local librarian, because they probably already have a stack of books that you can use. And a great thank you to my local librarians, because they are the amazing. I can walk in and say, I need this type of book in this form, and I have 3 minutes. Can you grab that for me while I run to class? And they're awesome about just being patient with me and handing me the book I need, and and off I go. But so partnering with librarians that are around. Children's authors make excellent partners. I link here to Jarrett Lerner. He's an author in Medford, incredible author doing this work. His work in books, getting books into kids' hands, making sure that there's equity for students and reminding students that they're a reader, regardless of their ability, that everyone is a reader. And being creative. I mean, really having to think about outside of the box, like what can we do? When your students are creative, they come up with ideas, and we're going to need new ideas. This is new work. And even if people say, well, I've been doing this for a while, we have, but collectively now, there's so many people working on this issue together, working to bring equity, working to bring far more inclusion and cultural responsiveness to classrooms. So we're all in this together, but we're going to have to do things very, very differently than we've ever done before. So being creative, check out his website. And the last thing is GBH resources. They're just amazing. They're easy to research. They're quick to implement. They're free. They're available online. So thinking about that, and then thinking about just the pain of this, I'll end with this, that the pain of what a lot of our students are experiencing. Their pain may look different, but it depends on their culture. Their pain may be because they're a student of color. Their pain may be because they live out in a rural area and they don't have great internet. They can't access some of their resources. Their pain may be socioeconomic. They don't have enough money. Their family is struggling. Their pain may be their family structure. It's all, and learning, what are we going to do with that pain? How do we help each other? How do we respond to the students' cultural pain? Is what we're all here for, to make these students' lives better so they can grow up again, seeing mirrors in windows and coming into their authentic selves. To do this work, you have to be authentic. You can't force it. You can't be something you're not. Students can sniff out the fakeness. They know if you're genuine. They know if you're really into this. I couldn't be this person who I'm not and say I'm doing this, this, and this. And I'm not. I'm like, I don't know the answer to all of this. I'm not a sage on a stage, but let's figure it out together. Let's find a different way. I have to be my authentic self. I have to do what I do and be myself. So this work can flow out of that. I'm recently been to a spiritual awakening and students course, and realizing just how important it is for your students to be themselves and to feel okay to be their authentic selves. And that's what we're talking about. Seeing those mirrors, seeing those windows, having educators and adults that respond to their culture, to what makes them them, so they can be their authentic selves, they can be creative, and then we can work together to solve this problem. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Carolyn. Thank you.
And thank you, Denise. And please rest your voice. Very powerful and authentic presentation. And the more I get to know you, the more I think how lucky your students are. So thank you very, very much. All right, Denise will continue to be in the room. So please feel free to comment in the chat. And I want to introduce a type of resource that you find on PBS LearningMedia called interactive lessons. In an interactive lesson, there are many types of resources on the site: short clips, lesson plans, documents, audio files, interactive activities, and interactive lessons. And Beth is going to be showing us an interactive lesson. So I wanted to kind of prepare you for what an interactive lesson is. It is a lesson that is created through a series of screens where students can do it independently. They can work in small groups. The teacher could be direct instruction and assigning parts of a lesson. But it's designed to be self-paced, where the student is working their way through a series of screens. The screens, and you're going to see an example of this, include a lot of media, short readings, often primary documents, primary sources, and a variety of activities. So the student is interacting with the screen. And assessment is part of this also. Vocabulary supports, everything, of course, is aligned to the standards. And these are easily assignable through Google Classroom, where students can save their work and then the teacher can view it. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, I just have some examples to show you the variety of interactive lessons on LearningMedia. There are, I don't have an exact count, but I believe there are a couple of hundred, and they are for K through 12 across the curriculum. So here are just some titles to whet your appetite about what is available, and I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Carolyn. Just a couple of notes before I get started. First, I wanted to applaud Denise and all the other educators on here, because you guys are in the classroom, and I think just by being here, you are doing an amazing job, and keep it up. I want to encourage you to do that. And then second of all, thinking about what Steven was saying and how he shared the 7 forms of bias, I realized that the interactive lesson plan unintentionally was the fragmentation and isolation. And you'll see in a minute when I talk about the lesson plan, it's titled Women Are Warriors Too. So unintentionally, I see what he's talking about calling out that women, why wouldn't they be warriors? But anyway, it's a great lesson plan. So we'll take a look at that. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. So this interactive lesson plan, Women Are Warriors Too, was part of a bigger project that we did at the station called the Warrior Tradition. And it was a 1-hour production. And there's curriculum that goes along with this production as well, which you can see on here, and that's on PBS LearningMedia. And there are 7 lesson plans for a range of grades. They're addressing grades 2 through 12. And there's also a discussion guide, a classroom poster on the website that you can download. There's bonus videos, and then this interactive lesson plan is also part of that. But the Warrior Tradition, the program focuses on the fact that Native Americans enlist and serve in the US military at rates that are proportionately exceeding any other ethnic group. So we kind of explored that, and the lesson plans reflect that. So you can go ahead to the next slide, Carolyn. And then this is the interactive lesson plan that I'm going to talk about. And as part of the Warrior Tradition, we commissioned Native American filmmakers to provide short videos to supplement the Warrior Tradition. So I used one of the videos, and the filmmaker, Minnie's War Bonnet, was created by a Lakota filmmaker, Yvonne Russo, who I think is on this webinar, and we'll say hello to her when I'm all done. Thanks, Yvonne, for being a fan, and thank you for this video. You'll see Minnie's War Bonnet tells the story of Minnie Hollowwood, who was one of the very first females to be honored with a war bonnet. So Yvonne's beautiful and engaging animated film really lent itself to being used in the classroom. So that's what's featured in Women Are Warriors Too. And on that page, oh, Carolyn, are you able to go back? I'm sorry. I just wanted to point out a couple of, okay. I just wanted to point out a couple of things on that page before we go to the interactive.
Yep. Just a second here. Let me just
Sorry.
move things around. That's all right. No. I apologize for advancing too fast here.
Okay, I just wanted to point out in the upper right, there are support materials for teachers, and you'll find that with all interactive lesson plans. So there's an introduction to using interactive lessons. And then specifically for this lesson plan, there's teaching tips, a document, and there's also technical notes that go specifically with this lesson plan. And then below that, there are related resources. And of course, these are from our bigger collection of the Warrior Tradition, but there's some related resources. And then also the standards are on that page. So if you're curious to see what standards that, this lesson plan meets. Now we can go to the interactive.
Okay, great.
So as Carolyn mentioned, the interactive lesson plans are student facing, but I think Denise put a little note in there that, teachers can do these right along with students, or many times they're assigned as, work for the student to do on their own. But in this, on page 1, I wanted to point out that before we get to many, that women have struggled historically throughout history. So I wanted to just briefly point out that there was the women's suffrage movement on page 1. So then we can go to page 2, where students are introduced to Minnie Hollowood, and there's a little background information about Lakota. And then at the bottom, students will find out what they will learn about. And in this case, they're going to hear from Minnie, but also some contemporary women who have fought alongside men. And then they will eventually be asked to explain why women should be given equal rights to serve in military alongside men. And then on page 3, this page gives a broad overview of traditional roles of Lakota men and women, and how maybe fighting in battles was not traditional at all for Lakota women. And then we're introduced to Minnie in this video clip, and the students are asked to think about the questions below. So when they're done watching the video clip, they can actually fill in the answers to the questions on the bottom of the page. So we are going to go ahead and watch. I just love this film. So we're going to watch the first half.
This is my home. It's known as Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Our creation story says Pahasapa is connected to the star nation of Pleiades. This is where our Lakota people come from. The stars tell us when the seasons are changing and when it's time for the animals to migrate. The animals like it too. Everyone is happy here. Wambli, the eagle, is our greatest friend and protector and is a symbol of strength, honor, and courage. Eagles take our prayers up into the spirit world for us. How was that, Wheatgo? Did you have enough to drink? Let's hit it, Wheatgo. Ah! Yellowhair and his men are coming. We must leave now.
Oh, one up. Yeah, bull. One chicken up. One chicken up. Ho, Iaio. Go with the women and the children.
No! I'm going with you.
Oha, right alongside me and stay close.
Oh, Han.
Okay, so we're introduced to Minnie, and then on the next page in the student lesson, they get a little bit of background on General Custer and the Black Hills, where they're located. That's where Minnie was also from, obviously. And the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was what Minnie fought in alongside her husband. And then the next page, students will watch, and we won't do it tonight, but please go back and do watch the end of the Minnie story. But they will watch the end, and then they'll have more questions to answer after they watch the video. And then the next page, a lot of background is given on what is a war bonnet, because students, may be familiar with what they look like. They may have seen them, but they really don't understand the significance of what they were. And war bonnets were they're very high honor to be given, most frequently after battle, and mostly to men. So Minnie was one of the very first women to ever receive a war bonnet. And then the next page, this is where students will see contemporary Native American women who also served in US military. And I think we're just going to listen to about half of this video.
The traditional roles of a warrior in regards to Muskogee, they were typically filled by males, but it doesn't mean that the women didn't possess the skills that they needed to be a warrior. They just weren't usually asked or called upon to fill that role. There were some conflicts when they weren't on a front line, yet they were attacked, and they had to defend themselves and their children and the elders that had been left behind. So I think that they've always been able to fill that role, but they just weren't called upon.
As a young lady growing up on the Navajo Nation, coming from a traditional family, you know, our traditions, women are not supposed to be hunters. We don't go on hunting parties or anything like that. And we have very distinct roles, what is considered sacred duties of Navajo women, which is taking care of the home, taking care of the children, but you know, I just had this curiosity about what was on the other side of the fence.
Oh, okay. So, so they'll watch the whole video and they'll be asked to think about the contemporary women, what they have similar, what they have in common with Minnie. And then they will be asked to write 2 to 3 paragraphs comparing the women and arguing why women should be treated as equals with men and given the same rights. And again, I said Yvonne Russo was on this webinar. I wanted to give her a shout out because she introduced me to Minnie. And as soon as I saw Minnie's story, I knew that I wanted to share it with students, that it should be shared with students. So I just wanted Yvonne to be able to say hello if you had a few words you wanted to say.
Hello there. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. It's so great to see you, Beth. And I really appreciate you sharing Minnie's story with everybody this evening. And as an Indigenous filmmaker, it's so important for us so that we're not left out of the national narrative. As you know, Native women have been left out. And my reason for creating the story for Minnie's War Bonnet was just to really influence and be able to at least teach in a way so that way our kids had a way to identify with themselves or their histories, which is so imperative for their own learning and also like self-esteem and such. So anyhow, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. And then that is the end of my presentation. Thank you, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you, Beth, very, very much. So we're winding down. We want to save some time for kind of open, responding to any questions in the chat and giving you a chance. But I just wanted to touch on a lot of other resources. You'll have all of the links in that resource document and also in the slides of the slide presentation. But again, just to inspire you to explore PBS Learning Media, there are a wealth of resources there, and you've just seen a little tip of the iceberg. So Arthur, the bespeckled, beloved aardvark, there are 3 different collections of resources on PBS Learning Media drawn from Arthur. All About Community is one of them. And in that collection, there are 2 that I wanted to call attention to. One is Becoming a Citizen. And in this one, it's all about just a student maintaining their own ethnic identity. When DW's friend Sheikh, who has come to the United States from Senegal, learns that he's going to become a US citizen, he's worried that he'll have to give up what he loves about Senegalese culture. And the other characters offer their notions of what is American. And you can watch the clip, or maybe you're already familiar with the episode to learn more. I'll call attention to, on the right side, you'll note these support materials that Denise and Beth have talked about. You'll find support materials throughout the site on the resources. And this is a lesson plan that has a lot of resources, media embedded in the lesson plan. America, Our Country, video and lesson plan. And in this, students consider what it means to be an American while preserving their own racial or ethnic identities and heritage. And they explore the idea that the US is diverse and welcomes immigrants and celebrates multiculturalism while preserving uniquely American customs, holidays, and traditions. So lots of lesson plans on the site also. We have done a lot of work with other webinars on specific collections of resources, and these are recorded links. This is one that featured 2 early elementary teachers, 1 kindergarten and 1 second or third grade. And they did a wonderful presentation, and it's drawn again from Arthur and Arthur's resources. I want to give a shout out to Molly of Denali. This is another collection on learning media. Informational text and Alaska Native culture are the basis of this series that's on public media, but lots of educational resources are drawn from it and available on PBS LearningMedia. Molly is set in rural Alaskan village. It features the adventures of Molly and her family and friends, and models the many ways that children can access and create informational text in their daily lives. And this I wanted to call attention to is one of the resources in the collection, First Fish Video. In this one, Molly catches her first fish, an important childhood milestone that persists today in her culture. She researches facts about salmon to help her. And when she finally succeeds, she follows the tradition of honoring one's elders by offering her prize catch to her grandpa. As students examine values such as sharing with others and respecting elders, they learn social emotional skills, as well as the importance in Alaska Native culture of connecting to all living things. And again, we had a webinar a few months ago featuring Molly of Denali. It also featured some folks who are involved in the production, Indigenous women from Alaska. And so that will be available to you also. This is a wonderful project. Attention, anybody who teaches math. There is a collection called Math at the Core on PBS LearningMedia. It's the collection of most of the resources are for grades 5 through 8, but there's a part of that that is culturally responsive teaching and math, and it is appropriate for grades 3 and up. So I encourage you to look at this. This is the framing document, a link to the framing document for across the collection. These are PD documents that include videos and tips, and they're very rich. So 2 of them that are appropriate for this grade band that we're talking to tonight, K-5, numbers and operations in base 10. The guide prompts math teachers to frame numbers and operations in base 10 using big open-ended driving questions, and of course uses also multimedia resources. So a couple of examples of the questions. What do people mean when they refer to the cost of living, and how is it determined? About how much does it cost your family to live each month, each year? Should college be free? Questions like that to get kids talking and thinking. And then another one, as part of this culturally responsive math collection of PD resources, measurement and data for grades 3-5. And we had a webinar, yet again, we had a webinar. We run a lot of webinars on the culturally responsive and math. That was, gosh, it's almost going to be a year. Unbelievable. And you'll have the link to that recording if you're interested in learning more. Design Squad. Design Squad is a multimedia project. Some of you might be familiar with the show, which was on PBS for a while. It's what's the word I want? It's anyway, there are teams of kids who are doing engineering projects, and it introduces kids ages 10 to 13 to the world of engineering and invention through videos, online games, challenges, and interactive hands-on activities. And you can find Design Squad on PBS Kids and also on PBS LearningMedia. The goal is for kids to see engineering as a tool that anyone can use to make real change in their communities. Bringing the Universe to America's Classrooms is a collection on PBS LearningMedia. It's a collaboration between NASA and GBH to produce Earth and space science resources for K-12 on topics such as weather, climate, the water cycle, the history of Earth, the solar system, etc. And one of the lesson plans that's a part of that collection I wanted to call your attention to is identifying different types of weather. So you can check that out if you're interested in that. And Sci Girls is a collection that's a production of Twin City Public Television in Minneapolis. This This project has been around for a while. They have done wonderful work, and the whole goal of this is to change the way that girls think about STEM, very rooted in research, with promoting strategies that work, and those strategies are the foundation of the project of Sci Girls. The resources are drawn from half-hour programs, episodes of Sci Girls, which was on television, provide gender equitable teaching strategies, hand-on inquiries. Each episode highlights the processes of science and engineering, following a different group of middle school girls who design, along with the help of a mentor. And here's just banners to show you examples of other collections that are available on the site, and you'll have links to those too. So much to talk about, but I want to end and give us a chance to look at the chat or maybe throw out a couple questions from your registration form. Again, this is a reminder that what you saw tonight is available on the free site, pbslearningmedia.org. You are welcome to browse the site without signing in, but we encourage you to sign in because then you can make full use of the site. You can download, you can save resources to folders, you can have your students log in, et cetera, et cetera. All right, this is my belated Valentine gift to you. All of the PBS LearningMedia resources that we featured tonight, plus there are probably some more, I put into and created a folder. So take a snapshot of this or copy it or whatever. This will be in your resource document also. But this is a folder on PBS LearningMedia that will take you to a list of all the resources that you saw tonight. I hope that's helpful to you. And then I encourage you to take our post-webinar survey. We really try and keep getting better at this. We learn something every time we do it. And we do listen carefully to your feedback. It's anonymous. It's managed by our research team. And at the end of the survey, you are welcome to download a certificate to acknowledge that you attended the webinar. Coming soon, we have a couple things coming up. Thursday, we are running a similar webinar to this evening. Steven will also be the kickoff presenter. And then we have 2 teachers plus another station colleague talking about an interactive lesson. And that is really for grades 6 to 12. But if you're interested in registering for that, please join us. And then we are in the planning stage now of a US history webinar series that will be kicking off in March. If you do not already receive our emails, we don't want you to miss anything. We run a lot of virtual events. We publish a lot of new content on PBS Learning Media. We have announcements. And if you are not getting our emails, please do sign up and make sure you do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Email me with any questions or comments you have. I will get you to the right person if it's not me. And I really appreciate your attendance and all the work you're doing. We know what is happening in schools now and how challenging your jobs can be. And we really appreciate you coming to spend some time with us. All right, I'm going to, Denise is in the chat. And if there's something that you wanted to call attention to, I have not been paying attention to the chat. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions I can throw out to the group, or you can just pose a question in the chat for the group now. And if the presenters want to come back on camera, that would be great. I think I'll stop sharing so we can just all be here.
A couple of people are asking for the survey link in the chat. Is that available now, or will that only be in the follow-up email?
The survey link is, you mean, is the survey link available? Can you take the survey now? Is that what you mean?
Well, people want to know if I can put the link in the chat and.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's go back. And I will, I don't think I can copy. Whoops, I just lost it. Oh, there, I went to the survey. There's the survey right there.
All right, we don't see your screen anymore. So if
Okay,
you
there
can
it is.
copy the URL and paste it in.
Yep.
But also, everybody, the link will be in the follow-up email.
Yeah, there, I'm sharing it now. Can you, everybody see it there? Is that visible, Denise, now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I can't copy and paste it, folks, so please take a screenshot of it if you want to do it right after the webinar.
I see there's a question about resources. Do you want me to answer that, Caroline?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions was about books, and I think you're asking about books for younger students, I'm guessing from this question. Epic has some great collections of diverse books. That's the online platform. It's free. There's a lot of collections already made there that you could use for read alouds. You can assign those books to your class. I would check out that free resource. Sora, Overdrive, and then also Scholastic, Storia. Those are also a lot of digital resources for students that maybe with COVID can't go to a library right now. Those are some great digital resources that are free they can access. Beth, I don't know if you want to answer this one or Carolyn. Yeah, and Epic is, available free during the school hours, but it does have those time restrictions. I always assign the reading a little bit early so they can, go in, and the parents can pay for it for extra. But the question is, what does a student do if they are brushed off? For example, they're saying they bring up a topic, about Indigenous people and, how these events took place, the teacher brushes it off. What should the student do?
I think it's a question that the other teachers should respond to and reflect on. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to, a couple of the questions that, several of the questions that came in were about what we're talking about now, recommendations of books, and also what to do about banning books. And the trend now to kind of have isolated cases of no, this book should not be available. So I'm going to paste in the chat some links that came from librarian recommendations. And but then let's see if people are able to respond. Denise, I'm sorry, I kind of muddied the waters here. Would you repeat the question just so people are know what we're talking about here?
Sure. Let me go back. Let me scroll up a bit. Oh, okay. So this one is, what should students do when they bring up topics and the teachers brush it off? So they're bringing up these issues of race, they're bringing up these issues of bias, they're bringing up these cultural issues. They mention it in the class, say they're studying about, Indigenous people, and they bring up a question, the teacher's like, don't worry about it. What should the student do? And I think this is, they're talking about young students. How do they navigate these very difficult waters of respect, but also bringing up the very important topics that need to be addressed? So that's the question.
All right, we'll see if anyone wants to join in. Again, this is a huge topic, and I appreciate you joining us and dabbling in it. Maybe some of you have already done a lot of work. Some of you are new to it. We'll continue to try and support you and perhaps host other virtual events around this, but we know that there's a lot of professional development and things available to you. Okay, we are at our time. So I'm going to leave the chat open for a couple of minutes. I want to thank Steven Chen, who had to leave a little early for his framing of the conversation and participating. He will be on the webinar on Thursday for basically the same topic, very different resources for grades 6-12. Denise Cooper, who teaches virtually and really rose to the occasion. She's hesitant about her voice right now, but thank you, Denise. Wonderful contribution. And Beth, my colleague in the public media world, wonderful lesson, interactive lesson is available on PBS LearningMedia, and thank you for your work with us on that. So, and Denise in the chat, the Denise number 2. All right, thanks everybody. I'll keep the chat open for just another minute or so, and then we wish you a lovely evening, and thank you for joining us again.